From the glorious, noble forces of the Stormcast to quite possibly one of the most vile and filthy races in the entire realms, today our faction focus is on those impossibly horrific and for a long time somewhat absent forces of the Skaven. Now back with a stunningly updated range, let's take a look at some of their new rules and abilities which are coming alongside them in AOS 4.0. Once again, like the Stormcast, they have their army-wide battle traits, one of their sub-faction battle formations, as well as a couple of units shown off today, and as before, we will be covering some of the spearhead stuff in a subsequent video. So this video today is just going to be stuff for the main game, the main AOS 4.0 matched play rules, rather than any of those additional spearhead bits. And so to begin with, their battle traits are focused around Skaven's innate cowardice and slippery nature. So the Lurking Vermintide is similar to the Stormcast in that it gives you a way to deploy in reserve for setting up some units later in the game, and then it ties in really well with two of their other battle traits. The Splinters of the Vermindoom is a once per battle round ability that at the start of the round you can set up a Gnawhole on the battlefield 9 inches away from enemies, 1 inch away from friendly units, and 3 inches away from objectives and terrain pieces. So this can limit your placement somewhat, but you should still have plenty of place to put this down on your battlefields. And you can have a maximum of 3 Gnawholes on the board at a time, by the looks of it, by the look of the rules, and this is where your reserve units come in from. The Gnawhole Ambush rule allows you to pick a unit that is in the tunnels below from your Lurking Vermintide rule, and they can then be set up within 6 inches of your Gnawhole and 9 inches away from enemies. So it is a bit more restrictive than the Stormcast that get deployed via Deep Strike, but it also seems that there might be less restriction in some ways because it doesn't state that you have to have a unit on the battlefield deployed for each unit in reserve. So I think there will still be a limit in the core rules, but you might be able to have more units in reserve compared to a similar sized army of Stormcast by comparison. It is still very, very strong and will mean you can get some of your units into some really tricksy locations on the map to disrupt the enemy and make it so they're not sure where your units are going to be scurrying out from, as well as to potentially get closer to some objectives and grab them in the late game. So it's always a really good ability to have in your back pocket, and it looks like this is going to be one that you will be using a lot as a Skaven player. They also have a passive called Too Quick to Hit, which is very thematic and very strong for your units. They get to retreat away from the enemy, and when your infantry and cavalry units do that, they don't take any mortal damage from using retreat abilities. Now, this may not seem super strong on the face of it, but this really will help you avoid some of that chip damage over the game as you retreat, which as a Skaven player, there will probably be a lot of interactions and rules and abilities that will be beneficial when you retreat, because that's kind of their big thing. Their theme is being cowardly and retreating. So making it a bit more feasible for your army to use those retreat rules to free up enemy units from attacking, or to free them up so that your units can shoot at them, or just to put them in a bad place for scoring or claiming objectives, I think is going to make this ability quite a bit more useful than it may initially appear. Finally, for the battle traits, they also have a once per turn ability. You use this in the enemy hero phase, and this is always 3 claw steps ahead. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to pick a non-monster unit that isn't in combat and wasn't set up this turn, and they can make a normal move as if it were your movement phase. So this is going to be really strong. It not only allows you to back away from an enemy and make their charges that much harder in their turn, but it's also going to be an incredibly strong tool for screening out enemy units, or getting onto an objective and denying it for your opponent, or just, getting out of range of shooting or getting behind line of sight blocking terrain. It is a really strong ability, and I think it's going to make a Skaven army just feel so slippery and difficult to pin down, which in the lore is exactly how a Skaven force should feel. So I am a big fan of these battle traits. I would say they are maybe not quite as overtly powerful as the Stormcast ones on the face of it, but I think they really play into the theme of the Skaven quite well, and if you use them correctly, they are going to make your army exceptionally difficult for your opponent to catch, so you can just get around the board and play the objective game and avoid those combats whenever you don't want to be in them. We also got told about one of the sub-faction battle formations. This one is all around Clans Moulder and buffing up some of their vile creations. The battle formation is called the Fleshmeld Menagerie, and the unit rule you get is called Prized Creations, and it's really quite strong. It is once per turn in your hero phase, and it allows you to select up to 3 non-hero Clans Moulder units, and then you roll a dice for each of those units, and on a 1 to 2, they take D3 mortal damage. On a 3 to 4, they get +1 to their attacks for their melee weapons, and then on a 5 or a 6, they also get a 5-up ward on top of that +1 attack until your next turn. So yes, there is a downside to this one. You can potentially hurt yourself, but it is also really thematic and Skaven-y, so you can't complain too much, I don't think. And then having a 66% chance of getting +1 attack on up to 3 of your units, as well as a 33% chance of getting +1 attack and a 5-up ward save on potentially 3 units is, I think, extremely powerful, and it can make even some of your less impressive units much more durable and much more terrifying in combat. I would say compared to the more reliable Stormcast one, which is you just give a unit a 5-up ward, yes, you don't have that inherent risk of mortal damage, but I think because you can do this one on up to 3 units, and you also have a chance of getting bonus attacks as well as a ward save, I would say it is at the very least equivalent in terms of usefulness. You might prefer the Stormcast one just for the reliability, but I think some people will like the fact you can get this on up to 3 units, and you can potentially get a slightly better version by not only getting the ward save, but also the +1 attack, so that chance of mortal damage is worth the risk. I suppose the only other thing to note is that this one is your hero phase only. The Stormcast one is in both turns, so you can use it in your opponent's turn if you are expecting a charge to shore up your defenses. This one is only in your turn, so you just use it to put on a couple of units that you want to charge in and just do as much damage as possible and then survive those hits back. But I do think it is still quite a strong battle formation. Also, like the focus yesterday, we got to see some of the spells and the abilities the Skaven will get. As mentioned yesterday, some armies get a manifestation law, and Skaven are an army that does. We get to see Summon Warp Lightning Vortex, which is cast on a 7 and only if you don't already have a Warp Lightning Vortex on the table, and then if you cast it successfully, you set up the vortex in 3 parts. The first part is set up within 18 inches of the caster, and then the 2 other parts are 7 inches away from the first part and in the shape of a triangle, so you end with a triangle shape. And then as you can see, the manifestation has its own unique war scroll and rules. So it has 7 health, it has a 6-up save, and then what it does is that in each of your hero phases after the turn it was set up, you roll for each enemy unit within 6 inches of it, and on a 4+, they take D3 mortal damage. And it also has a passive effect, which is that enemy units within 6 inches subtract 2 from their run rolls, and then if an enemy unit passes across the triangle's footprint, it also takes D3 mortal damage after they've finished their move. So this is going to be a really nice way to slow down the enemy and also to inflict a little bit of chip damage onto them. But I think primarily this is going to be a really nice way to block off parts of the battlefield and really funnel enemy units in a direction you want them to do, because they're going to want to avoid that -2 to run, as well as any mortal damage that they may take by being near the manifestation. So you can really use this as quite a big area to block off zones and lanes and force your opponent to go exactly where you want them to be, so that you can then charge or shoot them on your own terms. Following on from that, we do also, like yesterday, get a selection of war scrolls shown off with a couple of big units, and also the war scroll for their unique terrain piece, which is the Gnawholes. But starting things off, we see Screech Verminking, who is the great vermin lord himself. He has 13 health, a 4-up save, and a mighty 10-inch move, which is exactly the same as now, with the exception of losing 2 inches of movement. But much like Krondis from yesterday, I would say he's better overall because he doesn't degrade in movement anymore. It is just always 10 inches. He has also lost some output. His prehensile tail is gone completely alongside his Plague Reaper, but instead his Doomglaive has become the glaive of the Rat King, and it's gained 1 extra attack that hits on 3s, wounds on 2s, it has 2 rend, and it now does 3 damage, so it's 1 more damage and a little better wounding roll compared to his old glaive, and it also has the crit 2 hits ability. So now those 6s to hit will be doing 2 hits. So he can still get a good number of high damage attacks into an enemy when he needs them. He is still a wizard, although that has been nerfed as well somewhat. He is only a 1-cast wizard now, whereas in current AOS he is a 2-cast. But he does also gain a new ability in Terrifying Monstrosity, and this is his unique Rampage ability. And what it does is it allows him to pick an enemy infantry unit in any combat phase, and then once per turn, on a 3+, you roll for that unit, and if you roll a 3+, that unit cannot use commands. So he can turn off all-out attack or all-out defense, for example, but also they reduce that dice roll, the d6 dice roll, they reduce that from their control score as well. So he can actually do a scarily good job of charging into enemy units, debuffing them with no commands, and then stealing an objective from under them by dropping their control score until your next turn. He still has the dreaded 13th, which is one of the most hilariously cool spells in the game. It has dropped from casting value 8 to just 7, but it has unfortunately been quite significantly nerfed. You still pick an enemy unit within 13 inches and you roll 13 dice, but now instead of causing a mortal wound on a 4+, it is just mortal damage on a 5+. And then instead of summoning a wholly new unit of clan rats to your army based on the damage done, it just lets you return slain models to a friendly clan rat unit within 13 inches. So it's still good. It will still net you a solid 4 or 5 mortal damage on an enemy, as well as return a few clan rats, but only being on a 5+ means it's much less effective than before, and not being able to summon a brand new unit means it's much trickier to use this spell to block enemy movement or maybe inch onto an objective when you need it to. So I would say it's still not a bad spell, it's just not, in my opinion, as good as it once was. And then finally, he still has his rule, the 13-headed one, which is a long ability. It's done in your hero phase, and it basically lets you choose an effect which will buff your units around him. Now, this is notably different because currently in 3rd edition, they are all buffs to Screech himself, whereas in the new edition, they look to be quite impactful at improving the units around him. So for instance, you can get +1 to charge for friendly Verminous units wholly within 13 inches, or +1 to casting for friendly Master Clan wizards within 13 inches. So those are some pretty nice buffs, and I would say while Screech himself has picked up a few nerfs, this is a solid ability that means he is going to be much better at boosting the rest of your army and making them all perform better. So I think, points dependent of course, he could still be worth his cost even though his own personal output might not be quite as good, just because he is better at buffing your army now. The gorgeous new models for the Rat Ogres also get some updated rules, and again they've actually kind of caught a bit of a nerf, but hopefully the points will drop to make up for that somewhat. In what is probably the biggest warscroll change we've seen so far, Rat Ogres drop from 6 wounds each with a 7-inch move and a 4-up save to only having 4 wounds each with a 5-up save and a 6-inch move. So they are squishier, they are slower, and they have less wounds. However, they also get a change in that they now come in a unit of 3 rather than a unit of 2, and 1 in every 3 gets the warp fire gun that they carry. Now the warp fire gun has had a change, and I would say is better overall. It's no longer D3 shots that hit on 4s, wound on 3s with -1 rend and 2 damage. Now it only does 1 damage, and it is a shorter range at 10 inches, but it is now 2d6 shots, so much better, and they hit on 2s and wound on 4s. And on top of that, it's now -2 rend instead of -1. So you're averaging 7 shots rather than just 2, and they hit more and they have better rend. So there are some downsides to it, but I would say it's definitely overall an improvement. And then of course you have 2 other bodies with 4 health each to protect it, so it means it can stick around just a little bit longer now than perhaps it could before. The claws and fangs have bumped up to 5 attacks each rather than 4, but they have dropped to only hit on 4s. So compared to 3rd edition, a new unit in 4th edition has 15 attacks compared to just 8 that they have now, but they do hit a bit less. I would say overall it's probably an improvement, but it means that points-wise they are going to be quite dependent on that. If 3 ogres is much more than 2 are currently, then maybe it's not going to be quite as worth it. But if they are a similar price, you are getting 15 attacks rather than 8, so you could get some good damage out of them just through sheer weight of dice. The current ability they have, Rabid Fury, is also gone, and that basically gave you exploding 6s to hit. Each 6 to hit did 2 hits. That's now been replaced by the combat phase ability of Unleashed Warp Fury. This lets you inflict D3 mortal damage onto the unit, and in exchange they get +1 attack to their melee weapons for the turn. And I mean, this is okay. +1 attack isn't anything bad. It can bring them to a huge number of attacks with the Fleshmailed Menagerie battle formation, but to me overall, this is the first war scroll I would say that feels more of a downgrade than a side grade. We obviously don't know points, so that could all change massively, but for me there is a lot in this war scroll that feels at the very least a little bit worse than the current one. So I do hope the points reflect that so that we can actually see these brilliant new models on the battlefield sometimes. Up next we have the super cool Warp Lightning Cannon. This still retains its 8 health, 4 up save and pitiful 3-inch move, but let's be honest, this thing is all about shooting, and it still does that reasonably well. Instead of being a somewhat odd ability that let you roll a dice and then 6 more to try and beat that dice roll to see if it inflicted any mortal wounds, it now has a bit more of a normal profile. It's 2d6 shots that hit on 4s, and each hit just causes a mortal damage. So I think overall, the average is about the same. 6 dice to try and beat an average of 3.5 on a d6 compared to 2d6 shots that hit on 4s will probably be an average of about 3.5. So I think generally it's going to be fairly comparable damage output wise. And then you still get the bonus rule of the more warp lightning, which lets you just bump up the carnage. You add 6 shots to the cannon if a Skyer hero is within combat range. But then you do get the downside of that of each unmodified hit roll of 1 causes d3 mortal damage to the cannon. So this could get you up to potentially 18 shots, but then also on average about 6 mortal damage back to you afterwards. So this thing can be super swingy. It still has a huge damage potential, but whether you want to run that risk and use this swingy random weapon is, I mean, it's up to you, but you're a Skaven player, so I guess you kind of knew what you were getting into anyway, so you might just want to bring this for the sheer fun of it. Finally, we also get to have a look at the new Gnawholes. These now actually have health and a save. They've got 6 health and a 4 up save in this case, and they come with a few unique features. Volatile Ground can cause a load of mortal damage to an enemy unit that crosses your Gnawholes, potentially doing d6 damage to them, whilst Tunnels Through Reality remains as an ability that goes off in your movement phase and lets your units basically move between your Gnawholes. You pick a unit within 6 inches of a Gnawhole and are not in combat, and you can basically move to within 6 inches of another Gnawhole and 9 inches away from enemies. So this is going to help you avoid enemy units that are getting too close for comfort, or let you go and sneakily grab a faraway objective. And then finally, they have a once per turn command ability, which is called the Endless Tide. And this is done at the end of your turn. It allows you to pick a destroyed infantry unit and bring it back at half strength within 6 inches of a Gnawhole and over 3 inches away from enemies. So you won't be able to fight because you'll be over 3 inches away, but you can get really close to an enemy unit with this and use it to disrupt their plans or force them to charge your new unit that has just suddenly appeared in front of them rather their intended target in their following turn, and just generally be a really big annoyance. So this is very cool and potentially very, very strong, and I think this is going to be really key at saving a important unit from an imminent charge when you really, really need it to. So that is the Skaven. Overall, I do think there is some really fun, fluffy looking rules here. I would say compared to the Stormcast, there is perhaps a little more on the nerfed side comparatively, but I think it does still look plenty strong and really, really fun to play. But as always, what do you make of these rules? And what are you hoping to see from the rest of the Skaven tide? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me, but until next time, I'll catch you later, guys.